Sejam bem-vindos ao podcast Physio Frontiers. Essa é uma série especial do portal Fisiortopedia em parceria com a base de dados Pedro Brasil.
O objetivo desse podcast é contribuir para aproximar pesquisa e prática clínica em diferentes contextos, quebrando barreiras linguísticas e trazendo convidados internacionais que fazem a diferença na área.
Eu sou o Bruno Saragioto
E eu sou Tia Yamato.
e juntos nós iremos te guiar nessa jornada pelo mundo.
Prepare-se
E vem com a gente! Fala pessoal, tudo bem? Bem-vindo a mais um episódio do nosso Physio Frontiers podcast. Então, nesse episódio, a gente conversou com o Chad Cook. O Chad Cook, ele é da Duke University, nos Estados Unidos, ele é fisioterapeuta. Ele tem um livro muito famoso que eu acho que a maioria de vocês deve conhecer, que é em inglês é Orthopedic Physical Examination Tests, é de testes ortopédicos. Eu não vou me lembrar agora o nome em português, mas provavelmente você deve ter estudado com o livro dele na graduação, então é um livro super, super interessante, até hoje, né, muito usado. Ele falou um pouquinho do livro, falou um pouquinho da carreira dele, né, como a gente sempre faz aqui no podcast, e ele pesquisa muito terapia manual, então a gente conversou um pouco sobre, né, o rótulo terapia manual, sendo que a gente tem tantas, né, técnicas, né, tipos de terapia manual diferente, um pouquinho sobre o mecanismo da terapia manual que a gente ainda não sabe, né, ainda está numa nuvem ainda, né, a partir de mecanismo de terapia manual. E recentemente ele publicou, né, um artigo no Brazilian Journal of Physical Therapy sobre a infodemia que a gente vive, né, a quantidade de informação, né, e desinformação que a gente vive na área da fisioterapia, né, não é só, né, em outros aspectos da nossa vida, mas na área da físio mesmo a gente vive isso e viés de confirmação, então a gente conversou um pouquinho sobre isso, então acho que foi um papo bem legal para vocês, então fiquem agora com o episódio e see you soon. Tchau! Hello and welcome to another episode of the Physio Frontiers podcast. Today we have a very special guest with us. It's Professor Chad Cook. Chad is a physical therapist and a professor at Duke University in the United States. He has received over $10 million in funding and has over 300 peer-reviewed publications. He usually says he learns something new every day, but I think today we're going to learn from him, well, a lot from him. So welcome to the podcast, Chad. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Welcome, Chad.
Thank you both so much. It is a wonderful pleasure to be here.
Nice. So, Chad, we always start this podcast with more personal questions, I think, about your career. So, how did you end up being a physical therapist, and also how research came to your life? Can you tell us?
Sure, I'll try to keep it brief. I was actually I went to school for art for 3 years. I was
Really?
going to be a commercial artist,
Mhm.
and I realized I didn't want to be an artist because I was making more money working part-time at a music store than I would being an artist. So my mother actually convinced me to apply to physical therapy school because she worked as a administrative secretary for a clinical PT program.
Okay.
And so I applied and I was able to get in, and that was how I became a physical therapist. I knew nothing about the profession. I basically listened to mom because mom always knows best. And mom was right.
Yeah.
I picked a great profession.
Nice.
Research, it was very serendipitous, I think.
Mhm.
I became a teacher first, but I did not like teaching information that I didn't help create.
Mhm.
So I did my best to learn how to be a researcher. My very first works were not very good. I learned on the fly.
Mhm.
I received a PhD, which increased my knowledge in research,
Mhm.
but I did a lot of research before I got a PhD, and I'm still learning as I go along, still learning how to best do research.
Nice. And do you still see patients, so still on clinical practice in some way or not?
Not anymore. Now I do see some of the patients that are in our trials. So
Mhm.
I do see patients that most of it is virtual, most of it is telehealth now,
Right.
especially with COVID.
Mhm.
But no, I don't actually. I'm not in the clinic. The first, I guess, 14 years that I was in academia, I was also in the clinic at
All
least
right.
1.5 to 2 days a week. So I practiced as a PT for over 20 years before I actually stepped away and did mostly just research.
Nice. And can you tell us about your book, your famous book on orthopedic physical examination tests? So we know it is a bestseller worldwide. And when in your career did you decide to write it, and what was the motivation behind it?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning the book. It was a labor of love. I wrote that with Eric Hagedis, who was a good friend of mine, and we co-taught the musculoskeletal course at Duke. We were very frustrated with when our students went out to the clinic and learned from clinicians, they were being told to use a lot of tests that didn't have validity. And we realized how difficult it was for our clinicians or students to try to collect all of this information about tests while they were learning or while they were practicing. So we wanted to put something together like a handbook where you could go in and look at the quality of a particular test and what might be useful. So we had a relationship with Pearson Education already because I had a previous textbook with them. We pitched the idea. They loved it. And we wrote that book in 1 year.
Nice.
In 12 months, we knocked it out and we got it out. And it was really designed to be a handbook so people could go and look. Now we have the internet, right? The internet does that. You can go online and look at that. But at the time, there really wasn't anything like it.
And what was the year of the first edition?
I think the official year was 2008, but it was released, I believe, in 2007.
Okay. Yeah. I think every physio, at least in Brazil, at least every physio here in Brazil saw your book in the graduation course. It's awesome.
That's nice.
Yeah.
You know, what's funny is when you author a textbook, you get no money for doing that. It's the royalties are not very good. So I used to joke with people, for every book I sold, I received about a cup of coffee for that book. But now it's a half a cup of coffee because the coffee is so expensive. So
yeah.
It's not even a full cup, isn't it?
Right. And Chad, I wanted to ask you about physical therapy in the US. For example, in Brazil, I think here it's still considered as a young profession. It's growing a lot, but most of the time in practice, we depend on the physician prescription, for example. And we lived in Australia, and well, I have the impression that it's more established profession there, where people go as a first point of contact. So I'd just like to know an overview of physical therapy practice in the US and how respected it is, even in the medical pyramid.
Well, we've been around 100 years in the United States as a formal profession. But I would say we're somewhere in between Australia and Brazil because we still rely on physician referrals. Unfortunately, physical therapy is not the first profession people think about when they have a musculoskeletal injury. And there are still barriers to getting to a physical therapist if you have insurance. In many cases, you have to get a referral for that insurance to pay for that physical therapy visit. So we're still challenging. Yeah, we're still being challenged by that.
Okay. And how do you see the evidence-based practice field growing in physical therapy in the US? Like, can you tell us this scenario?
So I see it growing in small populations. There are some people that are very, very passionate about elevating the profession and working at the top of our license and doing what's right for the patient. There are so many physiotherapists in the United States, and it's so easy to get a job, and it's not really challenging. You don't have to be a great physio to continue to be employed. Right. So there's very much a difference between a portion of the population who doesn't really strive to be evidence-based
Mhm.
and then a portion of the population that works very hard toward that, that is very passionate. So we
Mhm.
see this a big division between the two groups of physical therapists. Now,
Right.
I speak around the world a lot,
Mhm.
and I know this is it's selection bias, but
Mhm.
the individuals that I meet in other countries, they seem very passionate about growing and being great clinicians.
Mhm.
We probably are like everybody else. There's probably a bell curve of people that are passionate about it,
Mm.
but I wish we were more passionate in my country about
Mm.
evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
In Brazil, it's
It's pretty
quite
similar, I
similar.
think.
Yeah. We have
Yeah.
lots of physios.
Mhm.
Is most of them are not very well paid, but you can have those 10-15% that will be will differentiate from the others, or in research or in practice. But yeah, still on the
It
infant.
sounds the same.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay, now I'm gonna change a little bit the topic to talk about monotherapy. I know it's something you do a lot of research on. You're actually one of the most recognized researchers in the world on that topic.
Mhm.
Well, we know that now, in general, monotherapy works. They are recommended in the main guidelines for most pain conditions, especially chronic pain. However, I don't really know that we know how it works on the mechanism and pathways. I'd just like to ask you briefly, are we making any progress on that area? Because I don't see much of, I see new evidence on mechanisms, but I still think the monotherapy is still in a, I don't know, in a cloud of.
Well, I think in a cloud is a really nice way to describe it. So I believe so. Our most recent NIH grant is a U24 mechanisms grant, and the goal is to better understand mechanisms associated with any force-based manual therapy approach. So this also includes acupuncture, dry needling, that sort of thing. So I think we see the clinical outcomes, and they tend to support that manual therapy is as good as, or in some cases better than, a lot of comparative interventions. And then there's actually quite a bit of preclinical work, animal research and other areas that looks at selected areas of manual therapy. It's mechanisms of what actually happens. The problem is there's no bridge between these two. So we don't know if what's happening with these mechanisms that are studied in preclinical work is responsible for the clinical outcomes that we actually see in our patient population. We need some of that bridge, the translational work that's being done. And our U24 is really supporting that we actually give grants out in this, and we're pushing initiatives so that people will actually study that. I think we'll find that a lot of the mechanisms that actually happen and that occurred in a mouse or a cat or a dog study may not be responsible for the outcomes that we actually see in clinical practice. There are probably a lot of other factors, which, you all have studied before, like contextual factors or, common factors, or even non-specific elements that might be related, or even shared mechanisms that are related to that. But we don't know that because we haven't studied it concurrently. So that's the direction I think we need to go to better understand what is actually going on with this.
Yeah, and that brings me to another question, because there's something that always intrigues me is that when you talk to physical therapists, they at least here in Brazil, or I'm biased, but they never say monotherapy. They usually say, I'm using Mulligan's mobilizations, Maitland. They use the type of monotherapy or the technique. But when we read papers, or even chiropractors, but when we read papers led by researchers, somehow we standardize it all as monotherapy. What do you think about that? Do you think it should start dividing these different techniques or types, and maybe the mechanism will change or not? But how do you feel with the label monotherapy? And go even further, do we need a definition for that, or a clear definition?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, we absolutely need a definition of what we're talking about with manual therapy, because there are a lot of fringe techniques that I would not call manual therapy. I think I think they actually do manual therapy a disservice because I don't think they are grounded in science. I don't think they're grounded in strong understanding of mechanisms. So I would discount those. I would move them to the side. When I think of manual therapy, I think of spinal manipulation, mobilization, and soft tissue mobilization or massage. And there's a lot of mechanisms research that actually supports those. So now with respect to philosophies, we were very anchored. I did some early research in the 2000s of how anchored manual therapists were to philosophies. And they were, I think, 95% related themselves to some philosophical technique. I think we know enough now that it's not the techniques or the philosophies that lead to the clinical outcomes that we get. They're all pretty similar. All we have to do is look at the psychology research, all the different approaches in psychology, and they all kind of lead to the same direction. I think the same thing has happened with manual therapy. Probably it is pushed more by a person's commitment to a philosophy and the marketing of those approaches, more so than the evidence behind those approaches, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And what about patient expectations, Chad? So how powerful do you think patient expectations is for manual therapy interventions?
I think it's tremendously powerful. And, the research around it shows that it's probably one of the stronger, if not the strongest reason we see an effect. And matching that expectation to the delivery in that encounter is probably important. If you ask me, is it the physiological mechanisms or more of the psychological expectations, et cetera, I would probably lean toward contextual psychological more so than physiological. I think that probably is the biggest reason we see differences with our patients. Some people struggle with that. I don't. I mean, so much of any package we put together with our patient is going to be built around context. So definitely it's a very, but I would also not leave out the therapist's expectations in that particular approach as well. We have studied this, and Bishop's group out of Florida has studied this. Basically, what a clinician feels is going to make a big difference with the patient can also influence the outcomes. So it's the equal pose piece.
That's very interesting what you've said, and I totally agree, because I think knowing this context is very, very nice and important for the evidence-based practice. Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah, again, some people will say, well, that's a placebo. That's not a placebo. First of all, if it has no effect, then it's a placebo. But we have found that there are a lot of things that have an effect. Therapeutic touch has an effect. So that's not a placebo. I think people need to dig a little further in their understanding of placebo and sham with respect to this. Everything has an effect to some point. The mechanisms are often different across the different interventions. What we've been suggesting recently and what we hope to study is that there's probably a third shared mecanism which is the reason why everything tends to have a very similar outcome.
I feel thinking on the biopsychosocial model, maybe the effects is more complex on the biosocial aspects, but it's simpler on in the psychosocial aspects, but it's simpler on the bio aspects. Maybe it's that there's not much in there as they theorized before, right? And
to me, it's exciting though on the biological part of it. Some of the recent studies on biomarkers and looking a little bit deeper on the biology of pain conditions. I think we discounted those quite a bit for a while, and now they're making a comeback. I think it's a combination of all of those features, and that's what makes it so fascinating and difficult, and makes the job interesting. I think, rather than being a repair person, where you're just going in and fixing a car. There's always some sort of wrinkle that makes it a bigger challenge.
Yeah, and it's much more interesting, right?
Oh yeah.
So also, Chad, still on manual therapy, but put in my context, because I've been doing a lot of research on telehealth. So a question that people often ask at me is like, how to be a manual therapist without your hands? How to do that? My common hands-on therapy, like over the computer or smartphone. So I'll pass the question to you now. Now I have the opportunity. So can we do that?
Well, first of all, I believe you can. Now there'll be a couple of things that are missing. I think that hands-on relationship piece and just the therapeutic touch piece might be missing. But I think you can replicate movements, which are, I think, an important part of a manual therapy approach, through some form of augmented home exercise or prescribed telehealth-based exercise. And I do think there's an effect. We did one study where we looked at it, where individuals actually received an augmented, specifically applied, they did it themselves, and it has a small effect. So I do think that there is some merit to that. I think it gets back to how we define, again, manual therapy. If you look at how the NIH, our largest funding source in the United States, how they define manual therapy, it has to have a hands-on component. And if that's the case, we'll probably need to redefine what we're teaching in telehealth. But nonetheless, I think the principles of movement are the same. The principles of pain modulation are the same. And I absolutely think we can do that. I think there's potential value there.
Yeah, and telehealth is here to stay. We know that. We have few experience at the university here during the pandemic, trying to do self-mobilization, or even using, because manual therapists, chiropractors, for example, they use now exercise and they do education, promoting self-management. So I think it would be harder to define manual therapy from now on.
I do too. I think the lines have really blurred across the professions. And I know that our most recent grant, I'm a PI and the other PI is a chiropractor. And, it's like I'm talking to my brother. We say the same things. There isn't a lot different now, I think. There's such a common approach to musculoskeletal disorders that I don't think it's a profession area anymore.
That's right. Yeah, so changing a bit the topic, Chad, you have recently wrote a paper in a very nice editorial to the Brazilian Journal of Physical Therapy about a possible misinformation crisis that we are living in the profession and how evidence change over the time. So can you tell us a bit more about the findings of this survey and probably tell us about some strategies that we can use to fight the infodemic that we are living now or facing?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It was built around the believability survey that we used, and it was an international survey that involved, I think we had over 30 countries, physios from 30 countries. We had noticed a lot of misinformation on the social media, and a lot of people saying things that just simply weren't true. And whether they knew it wasn't true, or maybe they heard it from somewhere else, or maybe they had social amnesia and they heard it somewhere and they thought it was true, we didn't know. But we noticed that there were certain areas of therapeutic practice where it seemed to be worse, and manual therapy was certainly one of them. And then the other one that we actually thought it would be sports, because there's a lot of conflict inside the theories and beliefs around sports.
That's true.
And that's not what we found. So we actually did the survey, and we found two areas where the clinicians really didn't believe what they were reading and hearing. And one was manual therapy, and the other was actually modalities, which is interesting. And when the Brazilian Journal of Physio published the paper, they asked me, would you be interested in writing an editorial on misinformation? And the editorial really changed as I wrote it. So as I wrote the first edition, I sent it to Guy Simoneau. Guy said, this is good, but I really like this idea that we're an allied health profession and evidence changes over time. Can you emphasize that? So it really changed as the iterations changed. What I wanted to emphasize, and I don't think it's my best editorial that I've ever written, but what I really wanted to emphasize is that we are a profession in which new information changes how we think and what we do. And that's actually more common than it is a shock. So it was important for us, for me, to write that, hey, don't be surprised if something we said 5 years ago, 10 years ago is not what we advocate for now, because us, medicine, psychology, we are professions that evolve over time. So that was the hope that when I wrote that was the hope that I tried to get across.
Yeah. But it's really nice point too, because I also see a lot of confirmation bias in the area. Well, we see that in politics, and the algorithms of the social media, they help you to be more in a bubble. And I think it happens also with, like, when you're looking for an intervention or when you are in a philosophy, your Instagram can give you more and more information that is from influencers saying that this may be effective. I think yesterday I retweet your pyramid of the evidence, the update with the tweet as a main source of information. Here in Brazil is the Instagram still, but it's really hard now to fight misinformation in all areas. Do you agree?
Oh, it really is. And, a lot of people think I don't like social media, and it's the opposite. I think social media has a lot of value. For starters, I think for dissemination, it gets information out a lot quicker than what we used to deal with. And I also like podcasts and blogs and other mechanisms to introduce information to people. The piece that I'm concerned about is that a lot of people don't go a step further and actually look at that information themselves and make their own decision, because I don't believe in the extremes, right? I don't think all manual therapy is good, and I don't think all manual therapy is bad. I think it's somewhere in the middle. And it's the same with exercise, and it's the same with psychologically informed practice. Extremism is what's wrong. And what sells on social media, what sells on continuing education, the podcasts that people listen to, it's when people talk about extremism. So that's the thing that concerns me the most.
All right. And do you have any tip that you can give to early career researchers and early career clinicians about tackling this infodemic?
Yeah, overlearning is the thing that what I tell my PhD students is that when you do your dissertation defense, you want to be the most knowledgeable person in the room. You want to overlearn your material, and you want to be able to talk with authority about the information. That means you have to read everything. That means that you have to read anything that supports an intervention and that opposes an intervention. You need to know both sides of the story. And so if somebody has a particular interest in a given area and they're thinking about specializing in that or researching in that area, I think they really do need to know a lot about that area. And so overlearning would be the key.
Yeah, I agree.
Nice. Okay, so I think we are heading to the end of the episode, Chad, but we still have one last question for you. So this is something that we usually ask to all our guests. If you could get back in time and give some tips to the young Chad Cook, so what would you say?
Wow. So I think, when I was young, I really didn't have strong mentorship. And there was a lot of trial and error. And there was I did a lot of things that I thought I was supposed to do and that would be good for me, but I didn't really want to do them. And I also didn't realize there were so many different opportunities that I think if a mentor really knew me, they would have said, hey, you should consider this, and here's what you need to do. So I was a little late to accomplishing some of the things that I really wanted and then ended up doing.
Mhm.
So I think if I went back and talked to the young me, I would say find some good mentors,
Mhm.
have more belief in yourself that you can accomplish bigger things,
Mhm.
and don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to try harder on certain things and to do things, get outside your comfort zone. I think something like that is what I would say.
Awesome.
Nice.
Yeah, great. Okay, Chad, it was really great to have you here today. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening and or watching this episode. Please, if you like it, share with a friend and help spread the podcast. And we see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.